Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. Today I'm joined with Titaś Biswas, a sociologist and media film scholar. She is a doctoral candidate at University College Dublin and teaches media studies at Carlow College, St. Patrick's. Her work examines how pedagogy becomes a site of power, shaping bodies, memory, and culture, from the saffronized classroom in India to the fractured memory politics in Germany and the pedagogies of cinema and protest theater. Like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/organic filaments network. Titaś, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much for having me, and very, very glad to be here and talking about, well, some of those, I suppose, really dark political themes. But as you were saying before we started recording, they're quite relevant to the state of the world. So, yeah, it's good to talk to like-minded people about our work in that sense. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. You've taught across psychology, conflict, film, gender, and memory, while also writing journalism and creative pieces. How has that sort of, eclectic background shaped your approach to pedagogy as a site of power?
And that's a very interesting question. In a nutshell, I would say that I wouldn't see any other way to do it. And I wouldn't have known any other way to do it. So that's how it went experientially. But I started off as an economics student when as an undergrad. And a year later, I realized it was too constrained as a discipline and wasn't quite going to work out. And so I took up sociology and never quite left. So my academic background is almost entirely in sociology. But I've continued to, I think, sort of operate on the margins, teaching film studies and critical media, and drawing from an interdisciplinary background. I suppose it's just the times we live across and, the paradigmatic shift and the complexity of it all. And I'm very, very inspired. I think my work is very inspired by Deleuzian ethics. So there's a lot of emphasis on that. And I've been working on a Deleuzian project at University College Cork since last November. So that has also significantly helped see the world in certain ways that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. So there's that.
I was quite interested in your forthcoming article, and I think there was a sort of abstract on one of your pages where you frame pedagogy as body politic. Could you unpack that phrase, why the body is central to pedagogy and why it matters for studying fascism?
I mean, there are a couple of reasons, I suppose. One of those is that so we do have fascist studies, which is a developing field, and memory studies, which operates quite closely with it. But both of those disciplines are sort of shaped by, let's say, very long-standing ideas, particularly coming from disciplines such as history. And there isn't adequate critical input in there to shape the sort of defining underpinnings that we would require to be adequately critical given the times. So what I'm trying to say, to break down the jargons there, is that, well, neo-fascism is not going to look like fascism of the 1940s or the 90s. And it is not just about the brown shirts and blue shirts marching around with their swastikas anymore. It's more complicated than that. And it's more, as you say, I mean, I'm kind of shying away to call it eclectic, because I identify that as a rather beautiful terminology, to talk about hope and all sorts of grassroots social movements. But in a way, it is volatile, I suppose. Neo-fascism, it picks up so much of its characteristic features, of its ways of operating from all sorts of ideologies, non-ideologies that it finds symbiotic valency it can establish with, and that includes neoliberal capitalism, for example. So there are certain similarities with fascisms of the past, which would mean that there has always been a consistent focus on the body, and not just body fascisms, but fascisms inherently are associated, as we know, with a soil, blood, labor kind of rationale that it wants to talk about. And it's also very hyper-masculinist. It's very focused on its supremely patriarchal, patrilineal value systems, the trad wife model at the minute, but also hyperfecundity, which is the idea that women are only supposed to continue giving birth almost as an industrial unit. And I mean, labor is quite intricately associated with the human body, and that includes cognitive labor. I mean, of course, physical labor, but all sorts of labor, really, emotional labor, sexual labor. And beyond that, also when it comes to the realm of masculinity and men in general, and the way they have labored in this world and continue to be persistent workers in developing this new repertoire of neo-fascisms that is inherently associated with how the body labors, operates, produces, engages in production, in industrial production in particular, but also in the sense of attention economy. And pedagogy, to come to that, I think we're going to talk about this later. I think there was one of the questions associated with pedanticism, but inherently fascism tries to teach you things, and that is not just within the classroom settings, which is important, but also beyond the classroom, public pedagogies, lived experience, that sort of thing.
In that abstract, you write there's something eminently pedantic about the nature of fascism. And you're also building on the theory of Christian Fuchs, that media theorist on digital capitalism, who stresses the mind and body are first forms of media, and fascism sort of inscribes ideology directly onto bodies through discipline and rituals and repetition, both as a site of domination and, carrier ideology. So what makes fascism so dependent on media, these sort of rituals and teaching and classroom practices, rather than just laws and force?
Well, I mean, it does depend on laws and force, as we can see, or lack thereof. But of course, I'd like to focus more on reputation and ritual in this case, as you say. Very interesting ideas, and really interesting how you put forth the question there as well. So Christian Fuchs's work, yes, it talks about digital capitalism and digital fascism, and he's a techno-sociologist who's dealing with media studies, essentially. And my work kind of sits on the verge of media studies. It's kind of drawing both from sociology and media studies. So I suppose, yeah, it's really important body work in that sense. I think Ben Kinnear talks about this as well in a very interesting way, that neo-fascism has this way of turning fringe narrative into a kind of common sense and inculcating it as almost a repetitive ritual in everyday life. So it becomes part of lived reality. And I think the Deleuzian idea of becoming, which up until now we have looked at in really positive ways, becoming part of your research paradigm, becoming part of what Gramsci talks about, your resistance, anti-hegemonic resistance. But also the new far right, the neo-fascists would like to co-opt Gramsci's idea of cultural revolution as something that is of their own, which is a pity, because they kind of put him in a box for 20 years and bent his spine and his teeth fell out, and we all know how it turned out in the end. And he wrote prison notebooks in the prison, incarcerated in fascist Italy, was a secretary of the Communist Party. Yeah, it is quite a pity that you try to co-opt the same guy and his take on cultural revolution now, but that's the state of the world. We also kind of do talk about the RA talks about, let's say, Pepe the Frog. So there's Simon Strick, who's cultural historian based in Germany. who talks about how disjointed this is, how volatile and how sort of out of shape and how eclectic in a way this neo-fascist repertoire is, that it's almost reflexive in nature. It's reflexive fascism. It's able to just conjoin itself to whatever benefits it right at that moment. Think of Trump. Trump does not care. Trump is only interested in once being the public in most cases, one being whoever he thinks his opponent or audience is, receiving his vows, his words, his actions, and reacting in a certain way. So his actions are entirely dependent upon that sort of reception of that work. Well, I'll go back to Christian folks anyway and talk about rituals and repetition. So in a way, as Deleuze talks about fascism, he calls it a body without organs. And I think that's a really interesting way of identifying with it, in the sense that, it is like this machine, like this associated with this corporate consumerist machine, which goes on in this repetitive cycle of producing off of itself, engulfing itself, feeding off of itself in certain cases. But it's very unoriginal on that note. I mean, it's good at what it does, which is engulfing and consuming and repeating. But I mean, that's kind of the narrative, and that's the rationale that just goes in there. It's quite unoriginal, and in terms of evolutionary intelligence, it's actually quite stupid, to be honest.
I think in terms of pedagogy, it gives us an analytic to understand fascism in everyday life. And you've also described Safranai's classroom as the advent point of a fascist patriarchy. What do you mean by this? And how do small rituals, seating arrangements, or bodily disciplines carry that weight?
It's a complex cross-pollination between institutional pedagogical settings, like classroom settings, particularly in case of school education, as we have seen in case of India. And India is a really good example at the minute because it's the global south. It's actually South Asia. And we're not talking about European fascisms anymore. There's actually a couple of scholars, Shakuntala Banerjee, who talks about this, that this is sort of when you come back to the repertoire of Western scholars talking about fascism, there is a good bunch who would talk about that being constrained to the geographical limits of the West. But as Frantz Fanon talked about internal colonization, we're really good at colonizing ourselves. So that is also, I suppose, that signifies in a way that we're also good at producing our own versions of fascism. And it looks nothing like, and it isn't supposed to look like, fascisms of the West. So there are obviously criteria that sort of match, and there are historical underpinnings here as well, as in B.S. Munji, one of the founding fathers of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the parent organization of all saffron organizations of the Sangh Parivar in India, actually met with Mussolini in person and was inspired by his youth organizations and arms factories in England and France. And he came back and set up akharas, which are basically wrestling grounds for Boy Scouts in India. And that became that gave birth to what the RSS has become today, which is an organization that is simultaneously cultish, that is simultaneously a paramilitary organization. One of its wings is actually the Sanatan Sanstha. It is quite frightening as an organization. It's based in Goa, but we know that now that they're responsible for the assassinations of at least 4 scholars and journalists, including Govind Pansari and Gauri Lankesh. So it's, not a secret. It used to be about, I think, 6-7 years ago. But of course, also people who have been arrested have just been released last month or so. So there's that. But going back to the, again, cross-pollination between classroom settings and public pedagogies, there is an interesting connection there in the sense that let's take the example of Saraswati Shishu Mandir, which promotes the trad wife model and teaches really young girls to act in a certain way, to be fragile, to be docile, to be nice, to be sanskari, which is, I think that translates directly to cultured, which basically means to be a good, docile Hindu trad wife material. And simultaneously, public pedagogies, as you know, in India are very encouraging of that trope. So if there are any difference, I mean, we're talking about repetition. So it's like this regurgitation of that narrative. It's like an echo chamber on its own.
I think it was Roger Eatwell who suggested that fascism holds together contradictions rather than resolving them. How do contradictions become a strength of Hindutva pedagogy instead of a weakness?
I mean, I think it's a universal case with fascisms in general and neo-fascisms in particular, but fascisms too. I mean, especially in the colonial times. So scholars usually look at proto-fascism and then Second World War fascisms and then neo-fascisms. But if you look at anything that started off after the Industrial Revolution, which is usually the fascists with capital F of Europe, I think they were always, I mean, if you go by narratives, they're just intellectually incoherent. And that has always been a strength, I suppose, in the sense that it allows you to participate in activities simultaneously that otherwise wouldn't have worked out. And I think the connecting point, the continuum that connects this is capitalism, really, because capitalism is contradictory, as scholars have looked at for decades, really, in terms of production. Also, it's pretty simplistic, and I don't want to sound reductive about this. There's a difference there in the sense that in terms of repetition, and I think Deleuze writes about this in Repetition and Difference. Again, it's this regurgitation. Even in terms of production, it literally just goes on producing the same thing cyclically. And especially in terms of the attention economy. I mean, look at Instagram, but at the same time, it's also, if you look at saffronization as a movement in particular, it says all these things about earthquakes being caused by women donning modern clothing, Western clothing, but at the same time is best friends with the billionaires and would like to continue, with their understanding with Elon Musk's and Mark Zuckerberg's of the world. So that's a glaring contradiction, right? But yes, I mean, that allows you to kind of continue, I think, gaining power, continuing to garner, continuing to impersonate certain methods, methodologies, domains of power, embody them, while at the same time kind of continuing to resonate with all these proto-fascistic, we were the original Aryans sort of narrative simultaneously. So that also appeals to the masses in a way.
In one of your recent articles in exploring discursive absence of colonialities in German pedagogies, you argue that German classrooms erase colonial atrocities while centering the Holocaust, creating a fractured memory culture. Can you explain a bit about that?
Well, if we were to talk about the post-structuralist take on memory anyway, memory is always disjointed, it's fractured. It's non-linear in a way. When Walter Benjamin talks about non-linear time, Bergsonian time, Deleuze talks about space in a non-linear way, right? So it's fractured in a positive sense. But the way I talked about it in that article, of course, is it's a materialist deduction of what's happening in there. And it particularly talks about Holocaust exceptionalism as a phenomenon that you only talk about. I think that's happened. I mean, scholars such as Norman Finkelstein would like to have written books on the subject, really. And Michael Rothbard has talked about this. There are other scholars who've talked about this. But the idea to kind of resonate with them and say that, we talk about the Shoah, and I would, of course, endorse the fact that there's rampant anti-Semitism that still exists around the world, but it's equally, if not more important, to talk about the ongoing genocide at the minute, because it's ongoing. It's a presentist concern, really. And the lack of that conversation there about the Palestinians, about Gaza, about the West Bank, And simultaneously about the massacring of the North American Indians back before American civilization happened, a genocide as an advent point of American civilization to start with, or talking about the colonial expansionist movements, Europe's colonial adventures, as Paul Gilroy calls it, the world over. And there are so many genocides to talk about. And I think it's important not to hierarchize genocides, because how do you do that exactly? And it's also, I think it exposes some of Germany's inability to address what happened in Namibia, what happened in Papua New Guinea. And just because it happened for a short period of time does not quite outright the fact that they were active genocides, and does not outright the fact that it has taken almost a year and a half for Germany as a state to be able to condemn an ongoing live genocide and starvation of children. It's just as simple as that. So there goes.
In that same article, you talk about Germany's fractured memory politics and how it helps legitimize its support for kind of kind of Israel. What does this tell us about pedagogy's role in shaping how Palestine is remembered or erased? Or do you see a similar dynamic at play with India's like saffronized sort of classrooms or pedagogy?
I mean, you must have seen the social media support for Netanyahu within the saffron circles. It's unbelievable. But it's also unsurprising at the same time, given that both have a common minimum shared in Islamophobia. And again, the struggle for Palestinian liberation from the times of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, as we know, was systematically destroyed by the United States and other imperialistic forces, particularly the United States and Israel at the minute, who have vetoed every other decision. And it's actually great that some of the countries within the European Union are finally acknowledging Palestine as a state, and even the UK has talked about this at this point. France is talking about this. Norway, Spain, and Ireland have recognized Palestine as a state. Yes, in a way, I think it does link quite directly to how we talk about colonialities, how colonialities shape our understanding of history, memory, and pedagogy. And there is a very bodily input in terms of understanding how all of that goes, because, well, partly memory and how memories are inculcated is associated with pathologies. And this is muddy waters, because I wouldn't like to go through the whole Oedipalization of memory culture. Again, I'm not taking the Freudian route there. I'm arguing the Deleuzian way that, in an industrial society, even memories, desires, they're all produced. They're part of the production process. They don't essentially stem from a lack. They're not essentially connected to the very constrained idea of mummy and daddy issues. They're more than that. We're talking about industries and states at play, and we're talking about capital here, which is, of course, associated with the patrilineal structure of the nuclear family, but it's not just limited to parental lack. So the idea would be to just suggest that, yes, I mean, when we talk about genocides, when we talk about colonialities, colonial politics, colonial memory politics, and body politic that is largely embodied, that is performed in classroom settings, that is learned through public pedagogies, unless there are active sites of resistance, unless there are alternative readings, unless there are alternative spaces, it's only more than likely that, it's very easy to be carried away by, again, what Ben Kameret's called turning fringe narrative into kind of common sense. So then Islamophobia or Netanyahuism becomes your form of common sense, its dominant form of common sense. It's very hard to decolonize that kind of repertoire.
You cite Michael Rothberg. I found that quote like kind of interesting. Absence is the most radical form of censorship. How do you see that playing out, not just in India, but in other places? And what type of pedagogy does that become?
So it's actually from a 1992 article written by Bourdieu and Lacan. We were both, it's, I think, kind of a book really written on reflexive sociology, where they talk about absence being the most radical form of censorship. And it's, It's actually very provocative, but also very true at the same time. Sometimes provocative things are true. Yes, it's quite right, because all of these, it ties back to the question that we were just talking about, absence, discursive absence, and so much historical erasure. There is this wonderful film called Sunless, directed by Chris Marker during, it was part of the left bank movement and part of the French New Wave. And he talks about Japan and Guinea-Bissau in this film to really address. It's a documentary on time. It's as weird a documentary as documentaries get and as the French New Wave gets. But it's really interesting how he talks about history and memory in there. And he talks about history throwing out of its window like empty bottles what it doesn't want to remember. And I think that quite sat with me for a while. Still resonates in the sense that mainstreamized history, as we know, kind of leaves out talking about affect, talking about grief and pain and lack and absence and erasure, and not in the Freudian or Lacanian sense at all, but in the sense of collective crisis that civilizations and societies and communities have faced through the edges, much like Marx writes, through the annals of blood and fire. So yeah, much in that way. It's a collective crisis, really.
And in the case of Hindutva pedagogy or some of the neo-fascist pedagogies that are emerging, how do they construct a fascist body, sort of in the sense that they have to be pure, like in terms of racial dynamics, disciplined? What is your take on the body politic of these fascisms?
Eugenics has always, as we know, raised signs in Germany. And I think, there is this absolute necessity to, when we talk about decolonization of pedagogical sites, of pedagogical modes of education, curricula development, all of that, memory politics, it's really important to understand non-positivistic ideas of interpreting space and time. And that would mean looking beyond this hyper-scientific, neo-Kantian, German Enlightenment-oriented ways of looking at the world. There are other ways of looking at the world. Patrick Bresnihan and Naomi Milner write a wonderful book on this called All We Want Is the Earth, borrowing from James Connolly. It's really interesting that when we look back at fascisms, and it goes back to, we're talking about so much about narratives and inculcation of the same through the body and embodiment of memories, of the things that are taught in classrooms, of the way remembrance works. And it's always fractured, but it usually, I think, favors majoritarianism and eugenics and race science and even the saffron repertoire in India, talking about them being the original Aryans. The whole blood soil narrative, it's very tied to the idea of homogeneity. So in a way, fascism flattens narratives. Whatever multiplicity, whatever pluriversality, multiversality is there, it attempts to flatten it and bulldoze it, homogenize it to this unified code, which is where we also start talking about techno-fascism. We start talking about what mainstream media and its ties with the capital has been making it perform fascism or fascistic tendencies in certain ways.
Yeah, I want to shift to your article, which is very fascinating, the class caste politics, hierarchy and Hindutva in Indian cinema and protest theater. You describe Bollywood as an informal pedagogy. How does cinema reinforce caste and patriarchy? Because part of linking caste and gender hierarchies to national identity is, central to the Hindutva project.
Oh yeah, definitely. Also very interesting question. I co-authored the article with Abhilash Banerjee. And yes, there was a part where I talk about Bollywood being an informal pedagogy. Remember that, I think. It is in the sense that Bollywood in particular, and not the South Indian film industry, because again, there is a language factor here. And, you must have come across this, that the Modi regime has been trying to establish Hindi as sort of the official language of India. more than half of India doesn't really endorse it as their mother tongue or a language that is spoken widely. So South India would be part of that. Part of the Northeast doesn't really speak that language. Bengal doesn't speak that language. Kashmir, of course, it's not exactly Hindi. There's Urdu and Pashto, and but again, it's not the cow-built code of Hindi that's the Modi regime is trying to impose. So long of the short, it's a very cow-built oriented politics of cinema. And it is very casteist so far as it goes. And as we know from the works of Didi Kosambe and scholars who have taken that Marxist, neo-Marxist interpretation of class being not disjunct from caste, but actually being an intertwined category. So there is a lot of historical erasure. And as we were talking about, it's the most radical form of censorship. It's absence. It's not talking about it. It's overwriting it. So there has been a lot of outcasting and overwriting in Bollywood narratives, as we know, in terms of choosing characters, in terms of casting actors, in terms of building the entire industry collective, in terms of narrativization and narratology, which are really strong tools when it comes to a fascist mediation and sociolinguistic influence of any kind, that be it in the classroom setting, be in case of media, it could be in case of a cinematic venture of any kind. And now we know that they're making propagandist films, Kashmir Files and the like. Yeah, there's definitely Bollywood's responsible. It's been doing that for decades.
And on the other hand, protest theater like Janam's Shambhukvad rewrites myth from below. How does this unsettle sort of the authoritarian pedagogy that Bollywood narratives try to reproduce in terms of patriarchal, Brahmanical family hierarchies and that type of thing?
So Janam, as you know, it was basically a venture. It started out with Safdar Hashmi and his friends. And of course, all the people who are involved at the minute are really, really important and have continued to carry on that's, well, I wouldn't call it tradition, but rationale and method of sort of building grassroots theatre movements on the streets and from the streets, which is great. And yes, Shambhukvad, so it basically talks about the mythological character of Shambhuk, who's also one of the less talked about characters. I mean, we talk about Ram a lot more, the Lord Rama, and we don't talk as much about Ravana either, speaking of mythology. So it's a bit like speaking so much about the Lord and Jesus, but not really talking as much about Lucifer, or talking so much about Eve, but not really talking about Lilith, who really refused to lie beneath anybody, really. So I think that rationale kind of applies there as well, in the sense that Shambhuk sort of refused to lie beneath this hierarchical class caste system. And so they cut his head off, in a way, decapitated him. And so Janam sort of brings it back and suggests that he has been being decapitated. It's very interesting how time is used here. I think there's a part where they talk about he has been, so it's like almost present continuous, that is being decapitated consistently, continuously, has happened historically, but also happening now. And it reminds me of Steve McQueen's lecture in Dublin, I think last year or the year before. He made a film on the Irish famine called Hunger, the famine and the hunger strikers, basically. And he was delivering this lecture and he said something like, history is notes. Walter Benjamin talks about that too. He talks about the body of history and memory being inextricable from this non-positivistic Yetzite now, here and now. So yeah, I think Janam does a good job at that.
I think what's interesting about that, it opens a space for resistance. But one thing I think that's central to what I understand about Safdar Hashmi is that he's insisting upon, the fact that class critique must also address caste oppression in a sense. And what does his legacy teach us about pedagogy or counter-pedagogies today?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I suppose we have to remember is, of course, that Safdar was assassinated on the ground while performing. And it's an important thing to remember. And as you were saying, you were interested in working around the politics of death, really. And it can be worked around in a number of ways in terms of actual labor and workers who are associated with the graveyard, but also in terms of necropolitics and fascism and neoliberalism, and how it kind of promotes a politics of death. And that is material death, but also, this continuum that kind of sustains, I suppose, the undead dead in a way. It's zombie land, but metaphorical at the same time. And it prevents regeneration, which is, I think, a sustained way of dying, really. So in a way, I think Safdar's legacy sort of defies the material underpinnings of death, because with death, basically the entity, the person goes away and then is forgotten. So being forgotten, this erasure, radical erasure is, I suppose, another form of death. And we see that that hadn't happened to Safdar entirely, that hadn't happened to Janam Malit's legacy. So I think performance and embodiment and cinematics and theatrics. And although, there's hollow theatrics as well, and we can go back to Trump's and Elon Musk's of the world, this constant state of performance. But there are other forms of theatrics too, radical theatrics, and ways to embody what you're living and replicate and reproduce and reify it in other ways and put up microcosmic representations to the world. And in certain sense, to live it too. To live is to perform in a certain light. And I think Safdar's version of that was to learn from the streets and to reproduce and lend some of that back to the streets and to continue walking. Walking is important despite all the fashionable nihilism that wants us to stop walking.
That kind of bridges into my next question surrounding radical theater, because radical theater often turns spectators into participants. And you actually mentioned the embodied form of pedagogy that resists this sort of authoritarian disciplines. How does radical theater sort of break down the barriers between performer and audience and produce like collective embodied knowledge in your understanding?
This reminds me of a scene from a Son Image film, which was I think, late 1970s, early 1980s. Films made by Jean-Luc Godard and his partner Anne-Marie Méville. There's this one film called Here and Elsewhere, which basically captures his journey traveling through Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine, and talking to radical artists, a group called Ziga Vertov, named after the Russian filmmaker. And he kind of comes back, and there is a scene where he talks about a lot of things, as French New Wave. They're almost essay films in a way. But there is a scene where he shows us that people are going around with placards in their hands in front of the camera. And it's basically almost like a history of cinema. It's like showing us that the placards are the ultimate frames that are being shot, but there are people holding them at the back. So I think it's a brilliant way to showcase the fact that no matter what we are doing, we are talking about human labor involved with it, even when it comes to artificial intelligence, even when it comes to data corps, e-commerce websites, when it comes to Instagram and Snapchat and Amazon and Facebook and all of that. So in a way, cinema has the ability to, as Deleuze writes as well, about time and movement image. It has this eclectic way of channeling present continuous in the moment. And there is a way to embody it. There is a way to live with it, not just as a spectator, but as part of the film itself, a part of the theater work itself. So theater practitioners or cinema practitioners, I think, have a role to play there in terms of allowing whoever's watching, spectator or beyond, to sort of become part of this extended repertoire, and also the other way around. In a way, the spectator also has an affinity, ability, space to offer, to become cinema or to become an extended part of the performance, but that would require desire, and desire in the Deleuzian sense from both ends, I suppose, this wanting to be involved.
You also mentioned that performance art re-narrates experiences of caste atrocity and neoliberal precarity. Do you see these performances as alternatives to the classroom?
Yeah, there was an interesting conversation we had in the month of May at a conference held at Maynooth University, and some of the media scholars and historians. And I think the topic was exactly the question that you just asked me now, about whether we need to think beyond the classroom as we know it today. The answer is yes. Yes, of course, we need to rethink the dynamics of the classroom, and architecturally so, emotionally so, and in terms of labor, materially so. So, the way we create hierarchies in terms of the lecturer being at the podium and the rest of the class kind of sitting there outcasted. And indigenous schools have almost always advocated the idea of sitting in circles, sitting close by, to kind of be by each other in concentric circles instead of creating vertical hierarchies. So we might need to rethink that in terms of how we even architecturally look at it, look at those setups, look at how we use diction, look at how we use movement, look at how we use spatial repertoire to start, finish, engage in a conversation. All of that. So yeah, I mean, of course, there's radical necessity to do that. And I think there's even more of an emphasis should be laid on how do we engage empathetically with one another, because this colonial amnesias, this culture of forgetting, socially produced forms of forgetting, are based in lack of empathy and are based in silencing. And one of the only radical ways to really, really fight that is to be able to think about each other and consider the existence of the other beyond the narcissistic self. So yes, there's that too.
Bringing the strands together from your work around classrooms, German memory, Bollywood, protest theater, why do you see pedagogy as sort of a constitutive terrain of fascism?
Well, primarily because of ownership, really. And ownership, as we know, I mean, the way we talk about labor and precarity and industries is usually when we can see the end product. The problem with talking about that in the pedagogical attention economy, neoliberal fascism's oriented sense is that the end product is floating somewhere in present continuous tense. It's happening now. It's being produced. Um, yeah, it's more difficult to kind of, and again, it takes me back to Godard's Here and Elsewhere, where he goes back to talking about production, and then suddenly the camera shifts to, I think, a concentration camp, and then it goes back to a car factory, and then it goes back to a severed head, and then it goes back to a prison cell, and then it goes back to a human DNA, and talks about production in alignment with all of that. So it's largely complex, really, this production chain that we're talking about. It's a complex system. But at the same time, it's also quite primordial to capitalism, in every sense of the term, as we are speaking of it now. So this mainstreamized version, this colonial German Enlightenment oriented version of studying history, this neo-Kantian way of looking at space and time and the world and bodies and what they produce and how they produce it and how it's dissipated and allocated in spaces and, permeated through other bodies, permeated generationally, permeated through the classroom and passed on in a way that all of that needs to be reorientated. It's a very constrained, unidirectional, homogeneous way, unfortunately, of looking at the world. And Michalino Zembidas and other post-anthropocentric scholars, Rosie Braidotti, Zeynep Gambetti, kind of look at it through the lens of looking at microfascisms, especially within the classroom setting. So colonial amnesias kind of micro-produce this lack of empathy and inculcation of this culture of apathy, which is very essential to fostering fascisms in our heads, as Foucault calls it. So, yeah.
You mentioned this earlier. Neo-fascism grows from neoliberal capitalism. How do you see the current era of neo-extractivism, digitization, these things coalescing, in terms of neo-fascism?
I think you got a glimpse of Tia here. She was trying to show her face. She always does that during interviews. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah. She's a star of the show anyway. So
I can repeat the question. My question was, if neo-fascism grows from neoliberal capitalism, how do you see neoliberal reforms converging with saffronization in India and elsewhere? I hope that makes it a little bit better to answer.
I mean, I suppose primarily is the de-democratization and the erosion of democracy, liberal democracy, social democracy entirely at the hands of this, rise of the far right or rise of neo-fascisms the world over at the minute. And they are connected in the sense that there couldn't have been any colonialism without industrial capitalism. There is no colonialism, so it's colonial capitalism and it's neoliberal capitalism too. Of course, they're tangentially, or I mean, sometimes even intersectionally, more like intersectionally connected to the rise of fascism. And I think there's a fantastic article by Cox and Skidmore-Hess who talk about this rise of liberal fascism from neoliberal capitalism. Well, they call it neo-fascism, but Henry Giroux calls it neoliberal fascism. So I think that's a really interesting way to refer to it as well, especially at the given moment now that we're looking at what it is becoming with every passing day. And but more and more radically so, as we see, is the case with the United States. I mean, there's really no facade anymore. It's just, out there. It is what it is. And we sort of have to take it as face value because it's a question of survival for almost anybody and even for people who are American citizens, I suppose, it does come down to dissenting. So, yes, I mean, erosion of democracy, rise of authoritarianism, and all of that has gone on since, I suppose, the advent point would be the creation of the IMF and the rest of the Bretton Woods institutions in the late 1980s. So early period of neoliberalization, and we kind of knew where this was going. David Graeber talks about this. Even Noam Chomsky talks about this. We sort of had an idea. Bob Jessop talks about this. We knew that this was going to go the wrong way. But yeah, at the minute, we see that materially this is what is happening. There is literally no press freedom. I was recently at the European Consortium for Political Science Research conference just last week, and we had a couple panels on academic freedom who had to talk about why researchers based in certain institutions at the United States cannot really come back to their countries, even to their sick parents at the minute, because there's this risk of not being able to go back. There's this entire question about citizenship rights, about human rights. So look at the state of Gaza and the state of Yemen and the state of Sudan and the state of South Asia and the global South in general. And Francesca Albanese has talked about this multiple times, that this is sort of symptomatic in terms of erosion of human rights for literally everybody. I mean, we always, when fascism is developing in the early stages, and it's not even early stages anymore, we intend to kind of believe that, maybe not the Hindu migrants, or maybe not the Sikh migrants, maybe they're better migrants than Muslim migrants, and they're not really going to come after immigrants who are less devious or appear to be so, who are not connected to Islamophobia and the industries that benefit from the persistence of it. But that's not exactly how it's working anymore. I mean, there are, again, cisgendered, heterosexual male scholars who are afraid to go back to the States at the minute. So in case of saffronization, as well as we say in India at the minute, and as we had seen, like literally again 2 weeks ago, incarceration of one of the scholars who had talked about an incident at Jadavpur University. And today, which marks the case of, there was this retrial of Umar Khalid, Sher Ali and the other 6 scholars. And we've just gotten to hear that, the Delhi High Court has just denounced the case all over again. So it comes down to the question of, and we don't know these names. Those names are really not talked about all that much. So why is Umar Khalid incarcerated? I mean, the primary fact would be that because he's a Muslim scholar. And what was he working on as a Muslim scholar? He was working on the Bastar indigenous belt and how the Indian government has been exploiting indigenous populations for centuries, really, first the colonial governance and then the post-colonial colonial governance, which is what fascism truly is in a way. It contains within its body materials that it draws from colonial repertoires. And we all know that V.D. Savarkar was one of those few who had written a massive petition to the colonial government, right? So the RSS and British Empire actually did work quite closely because, again, Muslims were supposed to be the bigger enemies, even back in the day. So that politics of scapegoating has historical connotations and underpinnings, but it also has presentist consequences, which is what we see at the minute. So erosion of democracy, democratic institutions everywhere, of press freedom, of academic freedom, but also largely of human rights and democratic rights per se. So, of course, that's the case with saffronization. Not to forget that there was a rise in hate crimes against minority communities by 300%, as Amnesty International had reported, between 2014 and 2019, which was the first time when Modi was elected after the UPA government at that stage. And we know that Amnesty International was kicked out of the country in 2018, I think.
So last 2 questions. What would a decolonial emancipatory pedagogy need to safeguard?
Reconceptualization of spatiotemporality and epistemology. So we need to, and these are really philosophical questions, but they're important questions. They're questions about how we look at the world, really. How we perceive the world multilaterally, polyvocally, in a polycentric way. And memory is, as we have been talking about throughout, it's polycentric, it's polyvocal, it's multilateral. In the post-structuralist sense, it's even fractured. But the kind of absences that we have so far talked about, especially imposed historical absences about, again, politics of affect, of emotionalities, that needs to be reworked, and that needs to be reworked from the bottom up, because as we know, it has been the other way around so far. It's always been hierarchical. It has been a vertical, hierarchically imposed intervention so far. So we need to rethink that architecturally, psychogeographically, and we need to rethink epistemologically in terms of how we look at the world, how we look at time, how we look at space, how we look at memory, how we look at gender.
So I want to conclude by asking you, what are the questions you're working on? Do you have any new projects that you're working on?
So yeah, it's a Horizon Inspire project. It's the Irish pilot, and that is happening at, well, it's based at the School of Applied Social Studies at University College Cork. And it's really interesting because we're trying to work with migrant women and sort of draw their voices in terms of how they perceive knowledge systems and how they perceive what acts as political barriers in terms of political participation, particularly in local governance in Ireland. But it's, again, it's seen through their eyes instead of imposing it in a top-bottom fashion. The other things that I'm working on at the minute are all somehow tangentially connected with sociology of education and war and genocide in a way or two. I think there's one article that might be of interest, which is a little different. It kind of looks at death of the young artist as a woman. So it talks about death in a Derridian, Deleuzian sense and explores that as a cinematic metaphor in the work of Yorgo Lanthimos and Michael Haneke and Theo Angelopoulos. So that's something that's entirely kind of rooted in cinema, but there are a couple articles on fascism and pedagogy and de-democratization and Deleuzian ethics. That is kind of, I suppose, of epicentral importance at the minute.
Thank you for so much for this conversation. That was our discussion with Titaś Biswas. These are difficult times, and her insights remind us that the struggle over pedagogy is also the struggle over the futures we are allowed to imagine together. If you found this conversation meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.